Thank you all for coming. Welcome to Jewish-Christian Relations in Poland, How One Town Overcame Its Past, a talk with Professor Magda Teter. My name is Helena Gindi. I'm the Public Program Director at YIVO. Tonight's lecture is YIVO's annual Podbrodzer Lecture and is supported by the Podbrodzer Progressive Benevolent Association. We'd like to thank the association for their generous support. This lecture was established to honor the Jewish community of Podbrodz, now named Podbrodzer. We are delighted to have Professor Teter with us here tonight. Magda Teter is Professor of History and the Director of the Jewish and Israel Studies program at Wesleyan University. She specializes in early modern religious and cultural history with an emphasis on Jewish-Christian relations in Eastern Europe, the politics of religion, and transmission of culture among Jews and Christians across Europe in the early modern period. Teter's work has been supported by the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, YIVO, and the Yad Hanadiv Foundation in Israel, among others. In 2002, she was a Harry Starr Fellow in Jewish Studies at Harvard University, and in 2007 to 2008, an Emmeline Bigelow Conlan Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, also at Harvard University. It's a great pleasure to have Magda here with us today. Please help me in welcoming her to the stage.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I have to say that my academic career in America started at YIVO 22 years ago when I came to the Yiddish program. So it's a delight to be here giving a talk. Okay, so what I'm going to tell you is a story that sort of happened to me, and I happened to be a participant of, even though I didn't intend to be part of the story. But it's a story about how one town is trying to overcome its legacy of its past. Also a story how scholars can help in such situations, facilitate these steps of facing the past. It's a story also broader of trials, tribulation, changes in Jewish Christian and Jewish Catholic in particular relations in Poland since the end of the Cold War. And for me, on a very personal level, it's a story about my father's hometown and also a story of how certain difficulties and obstacles can lead to creativity and quite unexpected results. So the town is Sandomierz, now a small, until recently rather sleepy town in southeastern Poland, but once an amazingly major and still extremely beautiful Renaissance, a medieval Renaissance town in Poland. Here you have an image of the main square with its gorgeous city hall and the beautiful houses, stone houses around it. Until recently, when it became famous for its TV series about a priest solving crimes in the town. Here is Reverend Mateusz, who is riding his bicycle and always solving crimes. Sandomierz was more known to people outside of it for its painting in the cathedral church that shows a scene or several scenes of the ritual murder, depicting, as you can see on this image, several scenes of Jews murdering Christian children, and it's a. I hope I was instructed by it, but let's just see. One of those will work, right? Okay, never mind. So as you can see, it's a multi-scene painting. At this beginning here, a mother or a woman is bringing a child to Jews who then murder it in a gruesome way very unusual for the story of blood accusations, extracting blood in a barrel that is fitted with spikes facing inward and collecting blood. Here you have a desanguinated body there on the, and then here at the bottom, the body, and this, if you can see, the child sort of resembles a form of a Christ, a crucifix, and then the dog vomiting parts of the, or eating and then vomiting the body. So this painting has been notorious. You can see obviously why, and has been the focus of the memory or the history of the town. It is. I'll talk about it a little later. It is part of a larger series, but we'll get to it in a moment. And the other paintings that for which the town was known, also, although they are smaller, were a series of 8 paintings in a more off-centered church, St. Paul's Church in Sandomierz, also depicting a series of so how does it work? I know you showed it. On the side, okay. Okay, and what do I press? The red one, okay. Yes, it does work. So I turned it off, that's why it didn't work. So again, a series of, and we'll take a look at them as well in a moment. But just to give you a sense of how Sandomierz was perceived both in Poland and outside of Poland, I want to quote from a recent and a popular detective novel now being made into a film. This is the prosecutor speaking after a body was found, gruesomely murdered body. Sandomierz is the center of the so-called so-called legend of blood, the capital of the universe for the idea of ritual murder, the place where accusations of kidnapping children and the resulting pogroms were once as regular as the season of the year, the place where the church endorsed that sort of bestial attitude, virtually institutionalized it. The place where to this day there is a painting hanging in the cathedral showing Jews murdering Catholic children as a part of a series about Christian martyrdom. The place where everything possible has been done to sweep that bit of history under the carpet. Now, as I think about it, my God, this is as revolting as it gets. And then a few sentences later, the prosecutor describing the husband of the murder victim says, for years he has tried to have the painting removed, or at least get it provided with an appropriate sign saying it was still here as a memento of Polish anti-Semitism, a reminder of what hatred can lead to. But the church, the book continued, has its own way of dealing with things like that. They have not taken it down or put up a sign. When there was too much fuss about it, they hid it behind a screen and pretended it doesn't matter. So as you can see from these quotes, the 18th century representation of blood libels in Sandomierz became tied up in the difficult discussions about more recent past that engendered polemics and emotions on all sides, making it very difficult to engage not only in discussing these paintings and their history, and the events behind these paintings, but even making it difficult to discuss the history of Jewish-Christian relations in Poland without getting embroiled in polemic. Since the late 1980s, the topic of Jewish-Christian relations, of Jewish-Christian dialogue emerged in Poland. And that's when we really begin to have a thawing of interest and it starts with the publication of a few translations of Isaac Bashevis Singer's short stories. Then there are some other publications of Jewish literature, and then in the early 1990s, films begin to come up, and through the arts, the dialogue and the opening up of the question of Jewish past in Poland and Jewish culture in Poland, the shared history begins to emerge. And at the same time, the Catholic Church begins to open up, the Catholic Church in Poland begins to open up to the dialogue with Jews and Judaism. So in 1986, the Catholic Church in Poland creates the first body, a subcommittee for the dialogue with Jews. A year later, it becomes an official commission for the dialogue with Judaism, and in 1996, it becomes a full episcopate committee for the dialogue with Judaism. So you can see it's sort of self-confidence as the church is engaging in the dialogue. The steps that were taken by the church were a sign of opening up, and again, that is all tied up with history of post-war Poland, which we may address in the discussion, but I may not have time to discuss in detail here. But these were the signs after the fall of the end of Cold War of the church opening up as well. But the forces of what Joanna Michelic, a scholar, has called the closed church, a church that was felt beleaguered and closed to any dialogue about Jews or its past, were still quite vocal. So the controversy over the Sandomierz paintings illustrates the tensions between those embracing the idea of the open church in accordance with the Second Vatican Council for dialogue with other religions, and in particular rapprochement with Jews, and those reluctant to accept that path, and not necessarily rejecting, although there were some who obviously rejected it, but just reluctant in taking those steps. So on the one hand, well-meaning people, many of them devout Catholics from both Poland and abroad, committed to Jewish-Christian rapprochement, called for the removal of these paintings from the church, and in some cases even to their destruction. Or, as the quote above illustrates, at least calling to put a plaque next to them explaining that they depict anti-Jewish fantasies and have nothing to do with any truth. On the other hand, this call for the destruction or the removal of these paintings from these churches led to a defensive response from many other Polish Catholics, including members of the church hierarchy, who essentially dug their heels, refusing to denounce the events from 300 years before, and sometimes falling into a trap of using controversial language. Sometimes even well-meaning people, part of the dialogue, had to learn a new language of talking about Jews. It really came to learning how to speak about Jewish past in Poland, and sometimes that language was quite unfelicitous and led to anger on the part of Polish Catholics who were ashamed of the dark past of Polish-Jewish relations. And it happened even to a bishop who was part of the committee with for dialogue with Judaism. So this nearly 300 years old painting became a sort of lieu de mémoire, so the site of memory, a place for memory, where one image became the memory, crystallized the memory of all of the history of Jewish-Christian relations in Poland. We're not there yet. Let me just switch that. As the phrase lieu de mémoire was coined by a French historian, Pierre Nora, who argued that these lieux de mémoire exist because the milieu de mémoire, the locales and the context of memory, which had been part of everyday life, disappeared. And for centuries, Jews were part of Polish landscape, Polish society, Poland society, culture and history and economy. But since the end of the Second World War, despite any efforts, obviously, to revive the Jewish community, which was killed in its great majority, 90%, there was no Jewish community. And even today's revival of Jewish community does not produce this presence, Jewish presence, that was an inseparable part of Polish everyday reality until 1939. Thus, the memory of the Jews in Poland and about the gone forever past is now located in several of those sites of memory, the lieu de mémoire, such as the Sandomierz painting, or Kazimierz, the Jewish part of town in Krakow, or Auschwitz and other death camps. They all became powerful reminders and sites of memory. Yet, I would say that memory and those associated sites of memory necessarily simplify the past, heighten emotions, and mute the past's different colors and shades and textures. And in Poland, the awareness, again, through the opening up of dialogue and thinking about the Jewish past and Polish Jewish past, brought the awareness of intensified anti-Semitism in the interwar period, of course, the discussions of the destruction of the Jews during World War II, and they all influenced the reading of these paintings, reducing them to a symbol of a much simplified version of a really much richer, much more textured Polish Jewish past. So the controversy over the painting is not really about the 300-year-old painting and the events that led to its creation. It's really about, it's been really about the present. And it really reflects, in my mind, the state of Jewish or Catholic Jewish relations and dialogue in Poland. So just as Polish society began to look at its Jewish past in the late 1980s, historical artifacts like this painting began to be questioned. And in 2000, Reverend Stanisław Musiał, a Jesuit active in the Jewish Catholic dialogue in Poland, published a scathing essay about this painting in a major Polish newspaper, calling for the painting's removal from the cathedral and calling for the establishment of a museum of anti-Semitism in Sandomierz. This essay created an uproar. You can imagine it created an uproar. The chair of the Episcopate Council for the Dialogue of Judaism, which had been about 4 years old at the time, Bishop Stanisław Gondecki, published a response openly condemning such beliefs that anybody should believe that Jews kill Christian children, and condemning both accusations and claims like that. But he passed the decision on what should be done with the painting onto the local bishop of Sandomierz at the time, and added fuel to the controversy by using some infelicitous language in his response that again created further controversy and uproar, and it was used as a sign that the church is not ready for any dialogue. From then on, the controversy would soften and then would flare up again and again every few years, leading the Bishop of Sandomierz to cover the painting in 2006. And that's what the novel referred to, that the church doesn't know what to do with it, so wants to sweep it under the carpet and just covers it up behind the screen. So here you have that screen with the cloth. Behind it is the painting and another painting, but the screen had to be very big to cover it. And then first there was an image of John Paul II on it, and then the Diocesan Museum found a historical painting which they put on there to cover the screen. So the long, now nearly 20-year-long stalemate could certainly be attributed to the fact that both sides, the progressive Catholics engaged in the dialogue with Jews and what Joanna Michlich called the closed church, that for both sides, the painting was not a representation of that past 300 years gone, but a symbol of contemporary Polish anti-Semitism, damning for one side and slanderous for the other. Again, the gap between the groups was quite wide. The long festering controversy over the painting did not make anyone feel good. Not Jews and those Catholics engaged in dialogue who felt the painting's presence in a cathedral without any explanation legitimized historical legitimized the accusations of blood libels and was evidence of continuing Polish anti-Semitism. Not the Catholic Church, nor the local population, both of which became associated and tainted with the broad notion of Polish and Catholic anti-Semitism. And for scholars like myself and others, all this made research on this subject and in this town impossible. And that's how I got involved. I wanted to get access to the archives because the priest who was behind the painting, who commissioned the painting, kept coming up in my records in the Vatican. And I wanted to look at his letters and his correspondence, but because he's so close tied to the ritual murder accusation, the documents have not been made available. And I happened to meet with the bishop in town, and we began to talk about the painting. And this is a new bishop now. He became a bishop of Sandomierz a few years ago. And as we were speaking, we began to discuss a role scholars may play in sort of bridging the gap between these sides who are now not being able to speak to each other. And he suggested organizing a symposium which we began to work on together and succeeded in organizing it in January in 2011. And here you have the Bishop of Sandomierz. You can see me and two other scholars behind all of the seminarians from Sandomierz has a seminary for Catholic priests, for clerics. So all of the seminarians were asked to attend. I believe all of the priests, unless they had other duties to take part of. There were town tour guides, there were students from high schools, teachers, all, some over 300 people in attendance. And 6 scholars, 2 from North America, myself and Sarah Lipton, and 4 Polish scholars presented work on trying to contextualize these paintings. In that symposium, so Sarah Lipton talked about Jews in Christian art, the Polish scholars talked about local history, and I was talking about this painting in particular, and I was able to show that the paintings in Sandomierz are tightly linked to a case in 1472 in now northern Italian town of Trent. And now I'm going to show you some images. But the Trent case is actually quite important and explains the history behind the controversial paintings in Sandomierz. So here I want to show you some woodcuts. So the accusation in Trent, again, around Easter, Jews were accused of killing a Christian child, and the local bishop launches a trial against them. Most of the Jews are executed and killed. Women are forced to convert after a while. The Pope sends a delegate and an investigator to investigate the procedures and the trial. The bishop is stonewalling everything. It's a really an incredible story of intrigue, and not just the accusation, but the politics and intrigue between the different church bodies and officials. But importantly, that trial happened just a few years after the invention of the printing press. And what it did is, for the first time, it provided visual representation of the tales that may have been circulating in some parts of Europe, or were circulating in some parts of Europe, of Jews killing Christian children. For the first time, Christians were able to visualize this accusation. And here is one of the very first publications that pictorially represents the story. And here you have Jews represented as plotting to kidnap the child. They all have names. I just want to, and they are real names from the trial, so they are real historical figures. I just want to point out the third figure in the middle, right in front of the, supposed to be the ark, but it sort of looks like a Catholic altar, because his name is Tobias, so remember that name. Here, the Jew, Tobias is kidnapping the child. Again, remember that particular image. Here, there are a few scenes of Jews supposedly murdering this child Simon and torturing him. And then they are having a Passover Seder, and then they are trying to hide the body. And here the body is discovered. Actually, Jews discover the body and then go to the bishop and say that they discovered the body. And here you can visually see the Christians by their head coverings on one side, and Jews symbolically wearing a different head covering. It doesn't mean that they wore them, but they were pictorially represented as such. And then here you have, and this is important, the bishop really wants to create a new cult that would bring Trent to the map of Christian pilgrims. This is a Jubilee year, meaning there are a lot of pilgrims going back and forth to Rome, and many go through Trent, and he wanted to capitalize on that. So the boy is put on the altar, and you can see the ex votive, the votive offerings that the pilgrims bring, supposedly for miraculous interventions by the little boy Simon, and the bishop. And the bishop is right here, and these are saint patrons of Trent here, and the pilgrims are here. And then a few scenes of Jews being executed, and again, here is an image of the service that was accorded to Simon at the end of the 16th century by the Pope, again recognizing that he is, and again they call him a saint, but he actually technically was not called a saint, but a beatus, a blessed. So back to the painting, and I'll show you why it is really important to keep that Trent story in mind when looking at that. So this painting of Jews represented as killing a Christian child is part of a series in the cathedral church called Martyrologium Romanum. And it's a series of 16 paintings, 12 along the naves going from the back of the church to the front, one for each month of the year, and 4 under, and it's actually quite nice to be demonstrating it here, because if this is the altar, then under the organs, there are 4 paintings that represent local stories, one of which was the story of the ritual murder, and 3 others represent other stories from the town. This is a story of the Tatars slaughtering the Dominicans in Sandomierz. And here you have some examples I'll show you of the calendar representing a saint, a martyr for the day. And if you can see, there are little numbers here. You'll see here, and these are for the day. So this is for January. So here is somebody for January 2nd whose head is about to be cut off. Here is somebody for January 27th. Here I see the numbers, I think 10 here. These are supposed to be Christian martyrs, but they are represented in this case as Swedish soldiers. So this is very soon after the so-called deluge in 17th century Poland. Swedes invaded Sandomierz and did quite a lot of damage there. And the local artists have represented some of the attackers and the infidels, really the non-Catholics killing Catholics, in some of these contemporary garbs. And here you have for July, again, the numbers here are much more obvious, and the various ways of gruesome deaths that these martyrs had. So that was the local and the traditional, the way the calendar developed, that locally various churches and various towns wanted to add their own saints, their own martyrs to worship. And Sandomierz had, since the medieval period, asked for permission to add the Dominicans who were slaughtered by the Tatars. And then here we have the other 2 paintings. One was the Swedes blowing up a castle in Sandomierz, and the ritual murder. And the ritual murder, I think, is important because it connects to the calendar, because Simon of Trent was added to that calendar, Martyrologium Romanum, in 1583. And that legitimized the story, and that also allowed for Sandomierz to tie that local trial to the trial that had been acknowledged by the church. That is the trial of Trent. So if that seems to be a long or far-fetched theory, I want to show you something from the smaller church that I think is part of a more convincing argument. Where I've lost my track. So these are the paintings we've seen in the. They are about the size as they appear on the screen now. Sometimes when you show slides, they are bigger, but they're about the size, so they're relatively small, and there are eight of them. Until recent, they are renovated. They were recently renovated, and you can see the golden frames were repainted. But the story really gets exciting, because I had some. Here you have the paintings during the Restoration, and here you have an additional scene of the disposal of the body here. But the story gets really interesting because the frames before the Restoration had traces of tying the story to Trent. So here is the picture. What does it remind you of, this picture? Does it remind you of any of the images we've seen earlier? Tobias, right? Tobias taking the boy. Well, before the Restoration, before the Restoration, the frame had a text. And this text said, Tobias Judeus rapid puerum et eum in synagogam clam inducit. Tobias the Jew snatches the boy and furtively leads him to the synagogue. In the trials, the records that I know, and any records of trials of Jews in Poland, there was no Tobias, Tuvia, or anybody known like that. But there was obviously Tobias we've seen in Trent. And again, that iconography, even if you remember from that print. Moreover, the texts on the other frames, which are now painted over, and I could only find because in a 1915 guide to sacred art in the region, one of the priests described transcribed what was on those frames. So this scene had this text in Latin. So the boy extended in front of the cross and hurt all over the body with pincers and nails, having lifted his eyes toward heaven, gave up his Holy Spirit, extensus in modum crucis puer ac forcitibus et acutus toto corpore sanciatus, elevatis oculus in coelum santium emissit spiritum. This text reminds us very closely the liturgy from Trent. Extensus in modum crucis beatus Simonis, extensus in modum crucis puer, so a boy, not Simon, and diris forcipibus et acubus toto corpore. This is, I think, misprint or somebody who didn't transcribe it correctly, but this word makes no sense. Acutus, or should be acupus, toto corpore, sanciatus, elevatis oculis in caelum, emissit spiritum. It's exactly the same wording, except that Simon is now just a boy. In the first one, at least they had Tobias as the child. So here is the painting again. And then what I wanted to show you is back. What's going on? It's almost the same image, except that this one is from 16th century Italy, from Perugia, from, I think, 1594. Here we have them side by side. Very similar, right? So we have the similar elements here. We have very similar, not to mention, obviously, the figure of Tobias and Simon the boy. Now, you will notice that Simon wears different clothes in these paintings, that though the paintings are very similar in terms of the color scheme, in terms of the detail, the boy is wearing different clothes. And that is too, actually, a proof that the painting in Sandomierz is about Simon. Because according to the historical record, Simon, when he disappeared, was wearing a gray tunic, like on the Italian painting. But in later iconography, when Simon became this Beatus, this worshipped boy, he is depicted in a red tunic with the white, right? So you have again, so in fact, that red tunic is yet another pointer, even though he's now referred only as a boy, to Simon. So when I showed these images in the symposium, there was this gasp in the air, because until then, all these paintings have been seen as very local, that they were only telling a local story, but they are telling a larger story of Christianity, of of the accusations, of the transmission of the cult, of the transmission of knowledge, of the transmission of iconography and stories, and it becomes a quite an interesting story. And indeed, in this book from 1915, where I found these other, I had this image because that was the only one accessible, and a colleague of mine took a picture of it, but I couldn't take the images before the restoration of the other one, so I never saw the text of the other one. But the book that did preserve them described all these paintings as follows: as an illustrated history of the little boy Jerzy Krasnowski killed in Sandomierz in 1710. So even that priest in 1915 did not make that connection with Trent, which was, I think, very obvious to those people in the 18th century. And some 2 decades later, a Polish writer, very famous Polish writer, Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz, who spent a lot of time in Sandomierz, also saw the paintings as a reflection of the trials in Sandomierz when he referred to the visible river in one of the paintings as the Vistula River, which in fact is the Adige River in Trento in these paintings. So the restoration completely erased that connection with Italy and with that cult of Simon of Trent, which was condemned by the church and removed from the calendar, liturgical calendar, in 1965. And right now, the restorations paradoxically made these paintings solely about Sandomierz, about these trials of Jews in Poland. So for the first time, and I think in the 18th century, that connection was obvious with Trent because it helped legitimize the trials of Jews in the local town that were, by the way, opposed by local officials, but the priest who was behind them was pushing it. And that story of Simon, who was recognized by the church, gave legitimacy to the accusations and allowed for that iconographic representation. So the symposium in 2013 was the first time when the town was able to discuss these paintings without engaging in polemics, fights, and emotional debates, but that was able to sort of step back and look at them and look at the historical context, try to understand why they came into being in town. And again, the trial was discussed, the role of the priest was discussed, the iconography was discussed, the history of the calendar was discussed. And that, I believe that allowed the space for the next step to happen. So at this symposium, one of the persons present on the symposium was Bishop Mieczysław Cisło, whom we'll see in a moment, the chair of the Polish Episcopate Committee for the Dialogue of Judaism, and he announced that the next year, that is in 2014, the celebration of the annual Day of Judaism would be hosted in Sandomierz. The Day of Judaism was established in 1997 it was established earlier, but it was embraced by the Polish Catholic Church in 1997, again, part of that rapprochement we were talking about earlier, and is now annually celebrated across Poland in many towns. And each year, a town is chosen as the center of the celebration. And for 2014, Sandomierz became the capital of the celebrations of the Day of Judaism. This was a tremendous breakthrough for a town which was unable to talk about Jews at all, or without being defensive or without engaging into arguments. So the Day of Judaism was attended by, here is the Bishop of Sandomierz, Krzysztof Litkiewicz. Here is the chair of the Episcopate Committee for the Dialogue of Judaism, Bishop Mieczysław Cisło. Here is the ambassador of Israel. Here's his wife. Here's the chief rabbi of Poland, Michael Szudryk, and a few other bishops and high-profile Polish intellectuals here. And here is a panel discussion about both this painting and about the dialogue and the educational needs and what needs to be done in Poland to further understanding of Polish Jewish history and past here. And again, you can see the chief rabbi of Poland, very important Polish Catholic intellectual, Jan Grosfeld. Here's a Professor Monika Grabowska from Lublin. Here's myself, again, Bishop Mieczysław Cisło, and the director of the Catholic Information Agency, who was leading the panel. The day was ended with a service, not a mass, but a service in the cathedral, led by three bishops. Again, here's Bishop Cisło, who is the chair of the Committee for the Dialogue of Judaism, Bishop Niczkiewicz of Sandomierz, and Bishop Frankowski, who is an auxiliary bishop, who I recently learned used to be at least classified by some as part of the closed church. So here you have all sides coming together in celebration. The service was attended by the ambassador of Israel, Tzvi Rav Ner, and the bishop here is shaking hand as the clerics here in the background are singing Hevenu Shalom Aleichem. It was I've never been moved by Hevenu Shalom Aleichem, but I have to say it was probably one of the most moving moments to see this happen and these clerics singing it in the space which is the source of so much controversy and aggravation. The painting itself received a plaque explaining what it is, saying that Jews had never murdered Christian children, that Jewish law and religious precepts prohibit consumption of blood, and mentions also that since the 13th century, the popes had condemned such accusations. Here you obviously have a Secret Service people because of the high-profile guests here, and here is the painting with behind it. So here is a shot of the plaque. So what next, right? So the painting, it seems to have come to a closure. There is the plaque, there is the gathering, but as Bishop Cisło said, well, what's next? We can all meet together and talk and feel good about it, but what's next? And the discussion was about making effort to educate and to spread knowledge and educate young people in Poland. They kind of wrote off the older generation, I'm afraid. So it was in preparation for the Day of Judaism in Sandomierz. There was a lot of back work that was being done, and there are two high schools in the town participated over the year in various programs that dealt and that exposed them to the history of Jews in town, Jewish culture, and Polish Jewish history. So here you have high school students and the local regional museum that also exposed Jewish ritual objects. One of the schools became part of and became one of the schools of dialogue. It was a title that they earned for the programmatic work that they've done during the year, and it was organized by the Foundation for Dialogue Among the Nations, and the other school, and they prepared a historical sort of root of Jewish Sandomierz or Jewish history in Sandomierz, and the other school prepared projects about Jewish history in Poland and beyond. Here you have some shots from that here during the week preceding the big celebration in Sandomierz. There were several workshops by some educators from Warsaw. Here is Hanna Kosowska, who is an artist, a writer, and an educator, and is very active in Jewish education. And here she is, she's doing a workshop on kashrut, and the students then prepared a kosher meal at the end of the workshop. Here is a shot of the exhibition that the students prepared about Jewish writers and Jews in Polish culture. And here you have presentations of students of their own projects that were related to the history of Jews, either in town or even in the school. They had an exhibition of Jewish students in their own school that was called Students. They were our students, Jewish students in the history of our school. That was the title of the exhibition. And here, on the day of the Day of Judaism, the Diocesan Museum opened a multi-room exhibition devoted to the history of Sandomierz. They obtained a memorial book, the Iskierbuch for Sandomierz from the Yiddish Book Center. They retrieved a number of photographs of Jews in Sandomierz and displaying Jewish history and Jewish sites in Sandomierz. The exhibition is really beautifully done, and you can see receive some interest. Now, this photograph is interesting, and I show it because he is not doing his job, this young man here. He's a Secret Service guy, and yet he's not doing what his colleague is doing. He really got interested in what was shown. It was really a very powerful exhibition. It's still on view until August, I believe. And the second one of the rooms had the work by Hanna Kosowska, the artist who was also leading the workshops. And again, you can see various conversations taking place about the work that were very again interesting and works that were interesting and powerful. So the day ended with a high note, as you can see, after decades of conflict, and the chief rabbi of Poland said that it was a wise solution, to be sure a compromise, but a wise compromise, and thus the case is closed. He also emphasized that there had never been better times in Jewish-Catholic relations. But again, the story, the dialogue needs to continue, and it was very much acknowledged that this is not a one-time event, that it cannot be the one-time event, that there is still much work to be done, and that work should focus on the younger generation who needs to be familiarized and really, again, as I said, learn the vocabulary of talking about the Jewish past in Poland without using either controversial language, even inadvertently, or engaging in anti-Jewish stereotyping. So I'll stop here. I'm sure there's a lot you will add. I know there are many of you here who know a lot about Sandomierz. So and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you. And this is the book that came out of the symposium that was sponsored by the Bishop of Sandomierz.
Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to start over here.
What can you tell us about the pre-war Jewish community in Sandomierz?
It was quite a large Jewish community, and as one of those, Małopolska, the little Poland town, I think 30% of the population were Jewish. And many of in fact, one of the teachers who was involved in the School of Dialogue prepared a presentation and a whole program around the interwar period, because that's where the most records still are and most visual evidence there is that could be used. And then all the Jews were obviously rounded up and then sent to the death camps, and many of the people in Sandomierz remember that. The deportation of the Jews. What I was also told that after this exhibition, the museum, the diocesan museum, opened, a lot of people brought photographs from their own collections to the museum. So again, it began to open up areas that nobody had ever talked about in town. So again, it was a fairly typical town from this region with about 30% Jewish population in town, expanding since the 19th century on. And
what about indirect indicators of anti-Semitism? Years ago, upstate New York, I began collecting these cute little books, and they were catechisms. And one day I sat down and I decided to read them. And it was shocking what was in there. I mean, kids were taught to recite this stuff. So do those things, I don't know if they existed in Poland in the same way, but did they exist? Do they exist? And then secondly, I guess I saw the film Ida recently, and if I recall correctly, one of the priests or someone said, but I know that it's true, that there was widespread beliefs that were sort of promulgated through the years that the Jews killed our Lord. So how much is that still?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So obviously the Catholic Church had disavowed all these teachings that had been part of Catholic teachings for centuries in the Second Vatican Council. And and the Nostra Aetate papal declaration that will be celebrating its 50th anniversary next year, explicitly states this is a wrong teaching. And in fact, the Day of Judaism in Poland was structured in such a way, again, it's all in the 1990s. At some level, because of the communist system, Poland sort of missed that reform. The church did not necessarily fully embrace the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council teachings, and was only with Pope John Paul II, who, in terms of the aspects of Judaism, he certainly was very much pushing the Second Vatican Council teachings, and with the changes of the regime and the end of the Cold War, that the church began to open up and embrace some of the aspects of the Second Vatican Council. That said, not everybody did embrace that, right? And that's the whole theory of the closed church and open church, and those who are engaging in the dialogue and those who don't. So so even though the Second Vatican Council issued new catechisms and new liturgies, in Poland they were not immediately embraced. It only started to filter down in the 1980s and 1990s when, again, the church began to open up to that. So that certainly is true. But one of the premises of the Day of Judaism in the Catholic Church is that educational aspect of addressing specifically the liturgical text or the text in the Gospels or any other writings that have been used in Catholic education teachings that had been interpreted in an anti-Semitic way. So I don't have the list of the specific 10 items but that's one of the addressing anti-Semitism in the Catholic teachings. And again, it's a slow process. This is a beautiful story, and it certainly is a clear step towards reconciliation, towards finding a common ground, towards addressing the past and why such things were put up in cathedrals and what that means for Catholic history. But it's not a process that will happen overnight, and everybody in that room, in that panel, including the high-profile bishops, and understand that it's not necessarily an easy way, and you need to move slowly and methodically to address those issues. But officially, those lines have been removed and should have been removed, and the only groups that are still embracing it, and that's true for the United States and other areas, are the ones that reject the Second Vatican Council and actually don't recognize the leadership of the Church after Pius XII. So that there is this sort of difference. Yeah.
This is a little off topic, but I think it might be on topic. As far as contemporary Polish society, what, from your view, is the connection between Jews, Judaism, and the state of Israel? Is there a mentality where, like, the Jews aren't bad, but the state of Israel, that's a different story? And is there, I'm in the younger generation, I guess. I'm an X and Y generation person, and I teach at a university. I see younger kids all the time. And I see imagery in social media that looks like blood libel. It looks like Israeli soldiers killing Palestinian children. And so I see a pretty clear connection, and there's a really distinguish between Jews and the state of Israel. There's not to me, but there is in contemporary society. And so just in Poland, what?
Yeah, no, you're right that there's a lot of the anti-Semitic blood libel imagery continues, and it was certainly exploited in the Der Stürmer by the Nazis in the 30s, and then it was embraced by the anti-Semites and now anti-Zionists, those opposing Israel, and that's ubiquitous, of course, if you look at it online. In Poland, it's interesting because actually there is not much of this anti-Israeli sense as much as it is here, and that distinction. In fact, I mean, politically, Poland is one of the strongest allies of Israel. So I think you always have to distinguish, and I say it for not just Poland, it's the same for this country, for any country, that you have one thing is the government and the sort of administration, the official position, whether it's of the church or of a state, and then you have the popular sentiments. And the popular sentiments are a mix of everything from anti-Semitism to philo-Semitism, so it's really a whole gamut of that. But I do think that certainly the younger generation, and just as in the United States, the younger generation has very different view of the past and the current society. So the younger generation is certainly much more willing to talk, learn, discuss Jews and Jewish past. In fact, being Jewish or Jewish things are cool. You can go to Kazimierz, and that's the trendiest part of town. So there's certainly something to be said that there is a certainly shift from. And I've lived through the 80s. I witnessed the 80s and the early 90s, and then I came to Columbia to get my PhD in 93. So I certainly remember that period, that when things were just opening up, like, wow, you have the Jewish literature, you can talk about Jews. But there is still, after decades of silence, and that was an official silence, the Holocaust was not discussed. That is not, I mean, we all went, as a kid, I went to the death camps on an annual basis because Auschwitz was close enough to my school, and my summer camp was about 20 kilometers to another death camp. So it's not like it was not talked about. but it was always presented in the socialist sort of internationalist way, that 40,000 Dutch citizens died here, and 35,000 French citizens died here, and 15,000 Hungarian citizens died here. And we never were told that they were Jews. It was just seemed because the crimes of Nazi regime were shown as this like huge crime against humanity. So when they put it in those categories of different nations, it certainly seemed like a lot of nations were attacked by the Nazis. So that shift, that then, the majority of the victims were Jews, that's a big conceptual shift that needed to happen in Poland, that saw itself as the victim of the Nazi regime and then all these other nations, right? And that was a convenient way of framing it, of not facing the past, of the disappearance of, 10% of your population. And in some towns, excuse me, even a higher percentage, 30% like in Sandomierz, or 50% like in many others. So that's, so Jews were not discussed. And when I speak with Poles of the older generation, because of that silence, they don't have the vocabulary except for that pre-war vocabulary. And it's really a process of learning that the word Jew is not an offensive word. And yes, you can use it. You don't have to say Israelite or somebody of, Mosaic persuasion or whatever other words you might think about. And that's a process. So that's what's happening in Poland. And I did not get a sense of the same kind of animosity towards Israel as we get here in the United States. I don't know. There's someone else.
First of all, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
My father grew up in Sandomierz, or as it's called in Yiddish,
Zozmir.
And if you look at the two Yisker books from the town, neither of them have photos of the paintings and really veiled references to the paintings. And in fact, when I went back to Poland in '78, they said, don't go. But if you do go, you have to go to the cemetery, you have to go to the synagogue, you have to go to the house, blah, blah, blah. Stick your head in this church, we want to know what was inside. And I walked in, I saw the painting, and I saw the other paintings. And I kind of shrugged, so what else is new? And basically accepted that this is a church and that anti-Semitism was an inherent part of Catholicism up until that time. I walked away more impressed at a side chapel where there were Greek icons. That it was just one of the Byzantine princesses married a Polish nobleman as part of agreement. They put up a Greek Orthodox chapel. And it was covered during the Swedish invasion, and it was forgotten about for centuries.
Yes.
Only discovered in the 20th century. I came back, I was talking about the icons, and not about that painting.
Yeah.
Because to me, it was much more impressive.
Yeah.
Also, like Sandomierz was also, I think, ahead of its times. I was there in '78 and was back quite a number of times afterwards. The synagogue,
Which is I got this picture up
In
because
the-
it's
right
in the
behind
back of the behind at the end of the street. That's
is now the
synagogue.
state archives.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful repository of Jewish life.
Yes.
And when I was there was an active interest in, people who are from here? And I said, yeah. Oh, do you have any questions? And the staff had a list of questions about where did this go and where did that go? And in those days, you don't pick up a cell phone and make a phone call to the United States or Canada or Israel. So it took a few days till I reached my father, who reached some of his friends and the other people who were from Toronto or Buenos Aires or in Tel Aviv. to answer some of the questions about what did that place look like from the inside. And that the staff was, and this is in the 70s and 80s, and communism did not fall yet. And that this is an archive. My father was complaining that's terrible, that making it. I said, this was a place of worship. It's now a house of study. It's a different type of a house of study. But there's a recognition that this place was once a synagogue.
Right. And I just want to add that during the week preceding the Day of Judaism, students from one of the high schools were doing guiding tours of the archive of the synagogue. So it was open to visitors. It's divided, the main repositories in the main hall, but one was able to go and visit, and then again the students were engaged and were the tour guide. So it was again another step towards that change. And you're right. I want to ask. I think what has frustrated and I think contributed more to that defensive response was that there is so much in the town to see and appreciate for its beauty, that painting just obscured that its whole past, and both the rich Jewish past and was just obscured by those awful events that happened and then that are commemorated in these images. So again, now I think the town is recovering from that and slowly realizing that there is they can talk about them in a historical way, and that they can be presented as part of the past, truly as part of the past of Sandomierz rather than the present. I think that's what needs to happen for people to both learn from the past and move past and embrace a dialogue, is to move really the past to the past and see it as part of that painful history that they need to face, and not just focusing on either the good things or solely on the bad things.
Do we have a couple more questions?
Yeah, there were two more.
Okay. Just coincidentally, my father was also born and raised in Sandomierz, and I did go to the cathedral, and I had a similar reaction to the gentleman back there. I looked at the painting and I thought, well, what else is new? It didn't strike me as shocking because it was just sort of anticipated. But the one comment I did want to make was when we actually went on a roots trip to Belarus for my mother's town, but we were in Warsaw, and we went into a synagogue, and I didn't join the congregation because I felt that I was really not a part of that. So I sat in the back, and there were a lot of tourists coming in and out, sitting there, and I had such a strange feeling that their reaction to this contemporary synagogue and a service that was going on was a little bit about like tourists coming from Europe who go up to Harlem and watch a gospel singing, or going into Americans going into a Native American ritual and watching. It did not seem, and I think many of these people were Polish citizens who were touring, and they were looking around, and my strong sense, it was very disconcerting because it did not seem to me that these people were absorbing this culture they were watching as part of their own culture, but that it was, watching strange people doing strange things. So just an aside.
Yeah. No, I definitely, it's true that some of that is definitely part of that Jewish revival or interest in revival of Jewish culture, that it's that lost world and that sort of strange, foreign land and foreign culture. There's definitely that. And in vocabulary, again, as I said, I always, would warn, but that notion of Polish, Jewish, who is a Pole, who is a Jew, there is a very, people are not yet able, or don't know how to talk about those things. So that definitely there is some of that otherness that and it's a if you go to Kazimierz, it's a trendy part of town, but it's because it's sort of folkloristic in some way. It's sort of like Disneyland, Williamsburg, or something like that. So.
Okay, one last question.
So, first of all, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. In particular, my parents were born in Poland and then had emigrated, and I was born in Belgium, where they had emigrated to, and they survived the Holocaust there. But I've often visited back in Poland academically. I've lectured there a number of times, so I know academics, scientists, intellectuals in Poland in a number of cities, and have close working relations with them. And I think you managed to capture in a few words the complexity and full range of the very rapid transformation that has taken place in Polish-Jewish relations over the last few decades, and the fact that there's this confusing mix of phenomena. You could find, especially among older people, plenty of traces of anti-Semitism, but you could find among younger intellectuals lots of fascination with Polish-Jewish life and its history, and you can find non-Jewish intellectuals who are astonishingly knowledgeable about it. You can also find a lot of, as you alluded also, a lot of kind of kitschy feelings also, which make one a little uncomfortable. And you also find a lot of, because Poles in general remember the Second World War with a special intensity because of the historical experience, there's a lot of desire to, while recognizing that the Jews suffered terribly even more, there's a lot of feeling of having been fellow victims and a desire to reach across and make that identification. What I want to ask you about is sort of the mirror image phenomena, which is that it's my impression, and I get unpopular in synagogues when I say this, but that Jews in America are often a couple of phenomena. One is that they're often not cognizant of the way in which Poland has changed over the last couple of decades, the way the Catholic Church has changed in many respects, and the way many Poles, I won't say all Poles, but a great deal of feeling has changed. And it's hard for people to understand it, I think, perhaps because it just differs so much from what they heard from parents or grandparents. And I think it's important to make this kind of communication gap and close this and work. I mean, obviously a session like this helps do that, but there's a large gap there, I think. And also, for example, very few Jews know how strongly supportive of Israel Poland is internationally and so on. So all of these are things that I think need, with the complexity of the history, there needs to be more dialogue internationally as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, absolutely. And I also want to stress, and it's a little bit self-serving, is that this is exactly what scholars do. And in a sense that we do all this research that complicates these monochromatic, black and white images and perceptions, and I hope that as here, I think we can serve well in society of opening up dialogue that is so locked in these stereotypes that people are unable to talk to each other profitably. And I think in this case, it really was the fact that we were all able to step back for a day and just look at 300 years before, that we were then able to come back a year later and talk profitably about the now. And yes, you're right, the world is changing, it's complicated, it will never be fully, I think we're all wrong if we expect some sort of a pure Jew-loving Poland, just as, I mean, how many years since the Civil War here, and we're still fighting rhetorical battles in the United States. So it is all a very slow process, but again, through education and through showing the complexity of history, culture, I think we can only benefit from that. So Thank you for coming to this.
Can I say
session.
also
Thank
the?
you. I'll be
sen-
happy to talk afterwards. Yes.
Great. Thank you very
you.
much. Have a great evening.